Death and the King's Horseman by Wole Soyinka. Brief biography of Wole Soyinka. Soyinka grew up in British-ruled Nigeria. His family was relatively well off. His father was an Anglican minister and the headmaster of a religious school, which meant the family had access to electricity and radio at home. Soyinka studied in Nigeria at a college affiliated with the University of London and relocated to England after graduation, where he pursued an advanced degree at the University of Leeds. The Lion and the Jewel was his second play, and its success allowed him to move to London. Over the next 10 years, Soyinka continued to write plays and edit literary periodicals, both in England and Nigeria. In the 60s, Soyinka became involved with politics. He was arrested several times and kept in prison for 2 years, and one of his books was banned in Nigeria. Soyinka wrote Death and the King's Horseman in 1975 during a time of exile from Nigeria, and it's become one of his most famous works. He has been married 3 times and has 5 children. Historical context of Death and the King's Horseman. The story of Death and the King's Horseman is based on real events that took place in Nigeria in 1946, when the English District Commissioner attempted to stop the King's Horseman from committing ritual suicide. Several historians have noted, however, that the tradition of the King's Horseman following the king to the afterlife isn't actually rooted in religious necessity, and that at the time, the King's Horseman not being able to commit suicide wouldn't have rocked the community as much as Elesin's failure does in the play. The Egungun costumes that the Pilkingses wear are part of the Yoruba religious tradition. The costumes are worn so that the wearer can channel ancestors. This is why Amusa insists that he's actually looking at the dead when he looks at the costumes. Many of Wole Soyinka's plays and novels consider similar themes as Death and the King's Horseman, in particular the difficult relationship between traditional Nigerian culture and Western modernization. His other works include his early play The Lion and the Jewel, his novel Season of Anime, and the memoiraic The Years of Childhood. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is another well-known Nigerian novelist who considers the intersections between traditional Nigerian culture and Western influence, though in a later time period in Nigerian history. The play Abawaja, which was written by Duro Ladipo and published in the Yoruba language, deals with the same historical event as Death and the King's Horseman. Summary: near the end of the day, Elesin, the King's Horseman, dances through the market. He's eager to reach the market and assures his praise singer that he just wants to be in the market among the women, where he's happy. The praise singer makes sure that Elesin still plans to die later. Elesin assures him that he's happy to die, but now, he wants the women to dress him in fine clothes and enjoy life. To show the praise singer how serious he is about dying, Elesin dances and chants the story of the Not-I bird. The Not-I bird goes around to all people, animals, and gods, telling them it's time to die. All the beings tell the bird they're not ready and hide away. But Elesin says that when the bird came for him, he told it he'd be right along. As Elesin tells this story, the women of the market, including Iloya, surround him and dance with him. He and the women perform a call and response chant in which he assures them that he's going to die. Elesin, the women, and the praise singer discuss how honorable Elesin is, but Elesin takes offense when the women praise him. They're not sure what they said wrong, but Elesin finally admits that he just wants them to dress him in fine clothes. Elesin catches sight of something in the distance, and the distraction, a beautiful young woman, walks into the market. The praise singer thinks that Elesin is going crazy when he begins to talk about possibly being dead already. They discuss Elesin's reputation as a ladies' man, and Elesin asks about who the woman was. Iloya hesitantly explains that the woman is already engaged. This annoys Elesin, but he persists and says that since it's his last day on earth, he should be allowed to marry her, conceive a child with her, and leave this as a parting gift. Though Iloya tries to convince Elesin that this is a bad idea, she finally gives in. Later that evening, at the district officer's house, Simon Pilkings and his wife, Jane, tango through their living room. They're dressed in Egungun costumes. The local sergeant, Amusa, arrives with news, but is distraught when he sees the Gungan. He refuses to look at Pilkings or tell him anything, which makes Pilkings very angry, especially since Amusa is a Muslim and, in Pilkings's understanding, shouldn't be upset about this. Finally, Pilkings tells Amusa to just write down his report. Amusa's report is disturbing. Elesin plans to commit death, which Amusa says is a criminal offense. Pilkings and Jane believe Elesin is going to murder someone, and Jane suggests they skip the costume ball later to deal with this disturbance. Pilkings decides to just arrest Elesin. They call for their houseboy, Joseph, who explains that Elesin is going to kill himself so he can accompany the king, who died a month ago, to the afterlife. Pilkings sighs. He has history with Elesin. He snuck Elesin's oldest son, Olland, out and sent him to England to train as a doctor 4 years ago, despite Elesin insisting that Olland needed to stay for some ritual. They reason that this is the ritual, and Jane realizes that Olland would be the next king's horseman. Joseph excuses himself when Pilkings calls the natives devious bastards. Pilkings calls Joseph back to explain what the drumming is about, and is angry when Joseph says he can't tell. It sounds both like a wedding and a death. Joseph leaves again, and Jane declares that they need to stay home and deal with this. Pilkings sends Joseph to the police station with a note, tells Jane to put her costume back on, and shares that the prince is going to be at the ball, so they have to go. Back in the market, Amusa and his constables try to get through a group of women to enter a stall that's draped in rich cloth. The women insult Amusa for working for the English, mock his virility, and accuse him of trespassing. They refuse to let him any closer to Elesin and say that Elesin will prove himself more powerful than the white men by killing himself. Ioloya arrives to mediate the situation, but joins the women in insulting Amusa. Several young girls take matters into their own hands. They steal the officers' batons and hats, and then act out a scene in which they're Englishmen discussing the lying natives and the horrendous weather. This insults and embarrasses Amusa, but Ioloya refuses to come to his defense. Finally, Amusa and his constables leave. The women dance and celebrate the girls as Elesin steps out of the stall. He has just had sex with his new wife and says that the future lies with his child that the bride will bear. Elesin begins to listen to the drums, narrate what's happening, and dance toward death. The women dance with him as he says that the king's dog and horse are dying, and then the praise singer reminds Elesin of what he must do. Elesin sinks deeper and deeper into the trance, and the praise singer tells Elesin that if those on the other side don't honor him properly, they'll welcome him back. At the ball, the band plays music to introduce the prince. The prince is taken with the Gungan costumes, but the resident soon pulls Pilkings outside to explain a note that arrived from Amusa about Elesin's suicide. The resident reminds Pilkings that he needs to be vigilant in order to support the empire, and when Amusa arrives, the resident asks if Amusa is part of the riot. Pilkings tries to get Amusa to give him his report, but Amusa again refuses to speak to him in the Gungan costume. Pilkings dismisses Amusa as the clock strikes midnight. He and Jane wonder if this is the moment that Elesin will kill himself, and Pilkings runs away. Olland, who has returned from England, finds Jane outside and asks for Pilkings. They discuss her costume, and though Olland will look at her, he says she's still doing a disrespectful thing by wearing the Gungan. He explains that she doesn't understand why it's wrong because she's English. They discuss World War II, which is currently going on, and the ethics of killing oneself to save many others. Jane refuses to direct Olland to Pilkings, and is shocked when Olland says that he's here to bury Elesin and stop Pilkings from trying to stop Elesin from dying. He tries to make it clear that Elesin needs to die and is doing an honorable thing, but Jane won't have it. She becomes increasingly upset as Olland points out that thousands of Englishmen are dying in the war, something he suggests is mass suicide. Olland leads Jane outside to listen to the drums and notes the moment in which Elesin dies. Jane is disturbed by Olland's calm and attracts the attention of the aide-de-camp, but she sends him away. Alan tries to explain why he was so calm, but also attempts to excuse himself to go sit with his father's body. From offstage, Alan and Jane hear Pilkings telling someone to restrain people. Pilkings steps into sight and is shocked when Alan says that it would have been a tragedy had Pilkings succeeded in stopping Elesin. Pilkings refuses to let Alan go see his father and then speaks with the aide-de-camp. He wants to know if he can put Elesin in the cellar where they used to keep slaves. As Pilkings marches away, Alan and Jane wonder what's causing so much commotion. Their question is answered when they hear Elesin yelling angrily. Elesin races into view, but stops when he sees Alan. He falls at Alan's feet, and Alan insults his father and walks away. In his cell, Elesin stands, his wrists chained, and looks at the moon. There are 2 guards in the cell with him, and his bride sits demurely outside. Pilkings tries to talk about how calm and peaceful the night is, but Elesin insists that the night isn't calm by any means. Pilkings has destroyed Elesin's life and the lives of others. They argue about whether Pilkings was just doing his duty or not. Elesin explains that he's not at risk of dying anymore, as he was supposed to die at a specific moment a while ago. He says that he doesn't blame Pilkings, even though he's ruined his life by stealing Alan and stopping Elesin from doing what he needs to do. Pilkings tries to comfort Elesin by saying that not everything is as bad as it seems. Alan thinks that this is salvageable. Elesin disagrees, but thinks that he no longer has any honor and cannot even call himself Alan's father. Pilkings leaves, and Elesin tells his bride that he blames her in part for his failure, as she showed him that there are things on earth that he still wants to enjoy, and he didn't want to die. Pilkings and Jane return and argue if Alan and Yeloya should be allowed to visit Elesin. Elesin assures Pilkings that nothing worse than one that's already happened will come of Yeloya visiting. Pilkings shows Yeloya in and she immediately begins to berate Elesin. She says that he's dishonored himself and the world, and reminds him that she warned him this would happen. He tries to explain why he faltered, but she's unsympathetic. Yeloya says that she's coming with a burden. Pilkings tries to show Yeloya out, but she refuses to leave and says that Elesin must perform certain things. Their king will be upset in the afterlife, and he needs to let their king go. The aide-de-camp races in to say that there are women at the bottom of the hill. Since it's just women, the aide-de-camp agrees to let them into the cellar. They enter, carrying a cylindrical object on their shoulders that's covered in cloth. Yeloya says that it's the burden and the king's courier, and Elesin needs to whisper in the courier's ear so he can release the king. Pilkings refuses to let Elesin out. The praise singer reminds Elesin of what his duty was and says that someone else took Elesin's place. The women reveal that the cloth covers Alan's body, and the praise singer continues to tell Elesin how he has ruined things. Horrified, Elesin flings his chains around his neck and strangles himself. Pilkings tries to resuscitate him, but Yeloya tells him to stop. When he asks if this is what she wanted, Yeloya answers that this is what Pilkings gets when he doesn't respect the customs of others surrounding death. The bride closes Elesin's eyes and pours a bit of dirt over them, and Yeloya leads her away. Yeloya encourages the bride to think of her unborn child. Death and the King's Horseman characters. Elesin. Elesin is the titular horseman of the play. He's a vibrant man who loves life and, due his role as the King's Horseman, has been able to enjoy it to the fullest. He eats the finest foods, dances with the women in the market, and has sex with and marries almost whomever he wants to in the moment. Because the king died a month before the start of the play, Elesin must commit suicide to join him, and has had a month to prepare for his passage to the afterlife. The women in the market adore Elesin. He loves fine clothes, so they dress him in beautiful and elaborate cloth to commemorate his last day in the land of the living. He shows himself to be a jokester, a storyteller, and a dancer as he interacts with those around him at the market. Through the praise singer, Yeloya, and Simon Pilkings, the reader audience learns that Elesin is an extremely honorable man who's fully entrenched in the customs of his people. Elesin does choose to change up the customs surrounding his death a bit when he decides he must take a final wife, the young woman, before he dies, especially since the bride is actually engaged to Iloya's son. This suggests that Elesin is more selfish than the talk about how honorable he is might suggest. This is confirmed when later, Elesin fails to commit suicide, though he blames Pilkings, who arrests Elesin at the moment he tries to die, the gods, and his bride in turn. Elesin eventually admits that he loved life too much and didn't entirely want to die. Not dying dishonors Elesin beyond all recovery, so when he sees that his son Olin died to take his place, which dishonors Elesin even further as his son is supposed to give himself to his father like that, Elesin commits suicide with his chains. Iloya notes that even in the afterlife, Elesin will be dishonored and will arrive covered in the manure from the king's stallion. Iloya, the mother of the market, she has a close and friendly relationship with Elesin and, along with the praise singer, acts as Elesin's moral compass and a conscience of sorts. She wants to please him and is happy to do so by helping the other market women dress him in fine cloth, but she's also the only one to question him when he asks to take a young woman as his wife in the hours before his death. With this, Iloya shows that she has a vested interest in making sure that Elesin follows protocol and doesn't ruin things by changing the plan, as she warns him several times that he should make sure he doesn't leave a curse behind by having sex with his new bride. At this point, Iloya seems to not have much power, given that she feels she cannot deny Elesin his bride even though she thinks the marriage is a good idea. After Elesin fails to die, however, Iloya comes into her full power. She berates Elesin for knocking the world off its course and upending the cosmic order by failing to die. Iloya makes it very clear that women will have to bear the burden of Elesin's mistake by having the market women carry Olin's body to Elesin's cell so he can see how the consequences of his actions. She speaks often in Yoruba proverbs, which allows her to force Elesin to connect with his culture and his religion by interpreting them. After Elesin dies, Iloya blames Pilkings for killing Elesin and creating an environment in which Elesin failed and where a disaster like Olin's suicide could happen. However, Iloya also shows that she recognizes the importance of looking forward, not backward, when she tells the bride to think of her unborn child, not of the living or the dead. Simon Pilkings, the district officer in the colonial Nigerian city of Oyo, he's self-important, pompous, and has no time for the native religious practices, which he refers to as nonsense and mumbo-jumbo. Because he thinks so little of the Yoruba religion and the people, he sees no problem with wearing the Igungan to a costume party a few weeks after confiscating the costumes from the leaders of the Igungan cult of the dead. Pilkings is cruel and callous to everyone who is or who he believes is below him in the hierarchy. This includes Elesin and Amusa, as well as his wife, Jane. He's especially dismissive of Jane's attempts to make him understand the importance of being sensitive to the local culture and customs, and shouts at her to stop interfering with his work. Pilkings only takes Elesin's suicide so seriously because the Prince of England is visiting, and because of that, Pilkings feels that he has to look competent and in control in front of his superiors. His manner implies that the rest of the time, he takes control when the mood strikes him or when it suits him to do so, and simply behaves rudely and derisively the rest of the time. Though Pilkings says that Elesin dying wouldn't be a great loss, he's had run-ins with Elesin in the past and finds Elesin difficult to deal with and annoyingly entrenched in native customs. Pilkings does fully believe in the Christian idea that suicide is a sin. To this end, Pilkings does his best to stop Elesin's death, and succeeds. He tells Elesin that he's doing his duty by saving him, and refuses to consider that he's actually doing Elesin and the local people a major disservice. Olin is Elesin's oldest son and therefore is next in line to become the king's horseman. For years prior to the start of the play, Pilkings helped sneak Olin out of Nigeria so he could go to England and train as a doctor. According to Pilkings and Jane, at that point, Olin was a bright and sensitive young man, more suited to becoming a poet than a doctor. When Olin finally appears in the flesh, he's a handsome figure and wears a western suit. Through his conversation with Jane, he shows himself to be wise, honorable, and calm. He speaks highly of things like Elesin's death and the suicide of a ship's captain who exploded his ship to save civilians, suggesting that it's extremely important and usually worth it for one person to sacrifice themselves for the good of many. Because he's been in England for 4 years, Olin has a firm understanding of both his native Yoruba culture and English culture. He conceptualizes his involvement with the two cultures as a good thing, as it allows him to defend his native culture and understand why the English behave the way they do. Olin demonstrates to us how strongly he believes in Yoruba traditions when, upon seeing Elesin alive when he should be dead, Olin insults and disowns his father. He later kills himself to take Elesin's place as the king's horseman in the afterlife. Jane Pilkings, Pilkings's wife, she's far more understanding and thoughtful than her husband, though she also fully supports Pilkings in his work of policing the native population in Nigeria, and at times, seems even more dutiful to the cause than he does. She's the one to suggest that they skip the balls, that he can deal with Elesin's suicide. An observant woman who wants to understand, Jane often tries to tell Pilkings to behave more politely to the natives or explains that whatever he is doing is rude in their culture. Despite this, she also doesn't think highly of the natives at all and considers them primitive, while she finds English culture to be refined and superior. She believes in the Christian ideal of the sanctity of all life, so she's dismissive of Elesin's suicide and of the deaths of other individuals who sacrifice themselves for the greater good. However, she also doesn't see anything wrong with all of the young English men who are dying in World War II. During her conversation with Olin, she tries her best to understand why he wants Elesin to follow through with his suicide, and why Olin isn't upset that his father is dying. Though she's able to get information from Olin that helps the reader, audience understand, she herself cannot manage to see things from Olin's perspective. The praise singer. The praise singer is a man who accompanies Elesin and acts as his conscience and spiritual guide. After Elesin is gone, the praise singer will be the one responsible for singing about Elesin so that future generations remember him and know who he was. He and Elesin appear to be extremely close, and the praise singer is sad to lose Elesin to the afterlife. He offers to accept Elesin back with open arms if the gods and dead kings on the other side don't properly honor Elesin. As Elesin's moral compass, the praise singer offers warnings about taking a bride and spending so much time with women, and he leads the dancing and chanting as Elesin dances closer to death. Sergeant Amusa. Amusa is a native Nigerian man who converted to Islam several years before the action of the play. He serves under Pilkings as a police officer for the English colonizers. Despite being a Muslim, Amusa still has strong ties to the native culture and religion. For example, he cannot bring himself to look at or speak to Pilkings and Jane when he finds them in the Gungan costumes. He's easily offended and seems insecure in his role as a policeman tasked with policing the local population. He threatens violence against Ialoya and the other women in the market when they mock him and refuse to let him arrest Elesin. Theme analysis. Life and death. The action of death and the king's horseman begins a month after the king's death. Per Yoruba religious tradition, Elesin, the titular horseman, a title that signifies that he's in service to the king and shares many of the same rights and perks, but without the same responsibilities, must commit ritual suicide so that he can accompany the king to the afterlife. Things become complicated. However, when the Englishman Simon Pilkings, the local district officer, discovers that Elesin intends to commit suicide while the Prince of England is visiting, through Pilkings's attempts to stop Elesin from committing suicide, the play begins to explore the function and the cultural significance of death, both for the Yoruba people and for the English. Ultimately, the play makes it very clear that death is something different for every culture, and that interrupting one culture's way of thinking about the relationship between life and death can have disastrous consequences. For Elesin, the past month has been a time of transition. The death of the king a month before means that Elesin has had 30 days to prepare for his own journey toward death and has therefore been existing in a liminal, transitional state. Despite this and despite Elesin's assurance to both his praise singer and Ialoya, the mother of the market, that he plans to follow through with tradition and die the way that Elesin behaves and is described in the stage notes suggests that he's more connected to life than he might think. This, Soyinka suggests in his introduction, is the true conflict of the play, that Elesin is too entrenched in the land of the living to successfully cross over to the land of the dead to join his king. The most significant way that Soyinka demonstrates how connected Elesin is to life is through his desire for material and carnal pleasures. Elesin teases the women in the marketplace, which results in them dressing him in colorful, elaborate clothing, something that Elesin clearly takes great pleasure in. He also insists on marrying in the hours before his death for no other reason than that the bride, the young woman he sees walking through the market, is extremely beautiful and he wants to have sex with her. Both Ialoya and the praise singer suggest that this is a problem, whatever Elesin has to say on the matter. Ialoya cautions Elesin to make sure that his seed doesn't attract a curse. In other words, she tries to warn Elesin that participating in the marriage ceremonies so close to his death might tie him to the world of the living to the point where dying could become difficult when the time comes. Ultimately, she's right to be concerned. Elesin falters in his attempt to die and later, half-heartedly blames his new bride for tempting him. With this, Elesin admits that he did love life too much, even as he regrets that he wasn't able to end it. Despite Elesin's struggles to end his life the way that the Yoruba characters speak about death cast death as something not only inevitable, but honorable, especially when, as was supposed to be Elesin's case, a person has the ability to prepare for and embrace their coming death. This also suggests that life can be more fulfilling when a person lives knowing full well that death is on its way. This contrasts dramatically with the way that the English characters think of life and death. Pilkings believes in a Christian ideal of the sanctity of all life. Thus, Elesin's suicide is something blasphemous and unthinkable rather than a way for Elesin to exercise agency over how and when his spirit crosses over to the land of the dead. Interestingly, Elesin's love of life and the way he goes about enjoying his life suggest that even if he does still adhere to Yoruba beliefs dictating that he must die, he might have more in common with Pilkings than Elesin is comfortable admitting. Indeed, even Pilkings brings up a Yoruba proverb suggesting that nobody dies entirely willingly, no matter their station in life or their belief system. With this, Pilkings suggests that Elesin's hesitation is normal and understandable even within the context of his own belief system, and even if it has disastrous consequences. As appalling as Pilkings finds Elesin's ritual suicide attempt and as catastrophic as Elesin's failure is for Ialoya and the Yoruba people, more horrifying for everyone Pilkings, Elesin, and the reader, audience alike is Elesin's successful suicide behind bars after he sees the body of his oldest son, Aland, who took Elesin's place in the spiritual world as the king's horseman when Elesin failed to die. Being refused his original, planned death robs Elesin of all dignity and power. While dying as planned would have meant that he be honored by both the living and the dead, not being able to die dishonors Elesin in the eyes of everyone and makes it so that the tradition of the king's horseman cannot continue in the futures of the living given that Aland, who would have been the next horseman, is also dead. Dishonored in both life and death, Elesin kills himself with the chains that bind him, and Ialoya tells Pilkings that Pilkings is the one to blame as he usurps the vestments of our dead, yet believes that the stain of death will not cling to him. With this, Ialoya suggests that the true crime committed by both Elesin and Pilkings is not accepting the inevitability of death and not allowing others to greet death on their own terms, women and power. While Death and the King's Horseman is overtly about relationships between men and women, observing the way that all the plays women act and are treated by the men around them, offers extensive insight into how women function in Yoruba society and English colonial society alike. In both cultures, women are treated as keepers of culture and as the interpreters of their own cultures for others, suggesting that, while women in the play may not have power in the contemporary Western sense of the word, their power lies in translating the meaning and significance of events for others and upholding social order. In theory, at least, women reap the benefits of these actions when the men around them behave appropriately and honor them for their work. As the only named Yoruba woman in the play, Iloya, the mother of the market, is a compelling and powerful character simply by virtue of who she is. She's the only woman willing to question Elesin's intentions to his face when he asks to marry the young woman, and she's the most vocal critic of his choice to marry right before his death. In these situations, Iloya reveals that her role in Yoruba society is to ensure that things proceed smoothly and as they should per tradition. It's worth remembering that according to Yoruba religious beliefs, Iloya, as well as everyone else in society, women and men alike, benefits from men like Elesin doing what they're supposed to do. While the reader, audience, is never told exactly what happens if Elesin fails in his task, it's made abundantly clear that it will negatively affect everyone, both in the land of the living and in the land of the dead. In this way, Iloya is working to make sure that everyone benefits and everyone follows the rules, even someone as powerful as Elesin. The girls who turn Amusa away from the market when he first tries to arrest Elesin perform a similar function. Though unnamed, they nonetheless stop Amusa from ruining an important ritual and distracting Elesin even further from his important task of dying later. They also taunt Amusa for abandoning Yoruba beliefs and choosing to serve the English, in other words, for exiting their society. In this way, the Yoruba female characters demonstrate that their true loyalty is to their belief system and their culture. Anyone who stands in their way, no matter how powerful or what religion they are, will be condemned and dismissed, as evidenced most poignantly when Iloya brutally insults Elesin for failing to die and in doing so dooming the Yoruba people to a horrendous, if undescribed, fate. Jane Pilkings performs some of the same roles that the Yoruba women do, though the way that her husband treats her suggests that she has nowhere near as much power in her marriage as the Yoruba women do in their society. Jane mostly functions as a fumbling and poorly informed interpreter of Yoruba culture for Pilkings. Though she doesn't understand it, she takes Amusa's unwillingness to look at her and Pilkings in the Gungan costume seriously and attempts to make Pilkings behave respectfully and with more understanding in his interaction with Amusa. In this case, however, Jane has very little power to actually influence her husband's behavior. Pilkings does eventually dismiss Amusa for the night, but he does so out of exasperation and tells Jane that she's just as silly for taking Amusa seriously as Amusa is for taking offense in the first place. While Elesin teases the women and makes sure that he gets his way in whatever he wants, unlike Pilkings, he at least takes Iloya's concerns seriously. Jane also facilitates for the audience a conversation with Olland that reveals some of the cultural beliefs of the Yoruba people. Importantly, Jane wants to understand, which is more than can be said for Pilkings, but she nevertheless fails to either understand why Elesin must die or pass on information to Pilkings that might make him understand why he shouldn't intervene. However unsuccessful Jane might be in creating any meaningful action or change within the play, the questions that she asks do allow the audience insight into what's going on and why, which in turn encourages the reader, audience, to see Jane and Pilkings as antagonists, not righteous fighters for a good cause. Put another way, though female characters as a group don't necessarily enjoy any power that comes through action, their power is in what they say and what they can do with their words. Unlike the male characters, they can help others understand. Given that all the male characters are unsuccessful in carrying out their goals, Pilkings doesn't stop Elesin from killing himself. Elesin cannot kill himself in the proper manner, and Olland can't go on to be a doctor or the king's horseman. The play elevates the power of speech and communication over action, and suggests that it's only thanks to those who play an interpretive role that society will function properly. Duty and collective responsibility. Death and the King's Horseman is extremely interested in exploring what it means to be dutiful and honorable to oneself, to one's people, and to one's spiritual beliefs. Given that duty is what drives Elesin in his attempts to commit suicide and is also what drives Pilkings's attempts to stop Elesin, it's worth considering the ways in which the respective duties of these two men and their two cultures mirror each other. Though the play is upfront both in its introduction and in the text itself to show that Pilkings is inarguably wrong to try to stop Elesin from killing himself, it nonetheless suggests that the fault of both men was acting selfishly rather than acting for the greater and collective good, that is, doing their duty to others. It's important to keep in mind that while none of the play's characters explain what would happen if Elesin fails in his suicide attempt, Ialoya Alland and the praise singer all say at various points that the results would be disastrous. Alland points out that, while Pilkings fears Araya if Elesin succeeds, he should actually fear Araya if Elesin doesn't. Elesin's death is important enough to the Yoruba people that denying it to them is extremely dangerous. Despite the fact that Elesin is aware of the importance of his death and knows that it's the only way to maintain this cosmic order, he nonetheless chooses to behave selfishly in his final hours by marrying the young woman he sees in the market. Notably, there's no ceremonial or spiritual reason why Elesin decides he must have this young woman, and indeed, the woman is engaged and Elesin marries out from under her fiancé, who is Ialoya's son. With this, Elesin not only upends the equilibrium of the community by denying Ialoya's son his bride. He does so for no other reason than his own pleasure, because he later blames his inability to follow through with his suicide on his bride. This suggests that Elesin's downfall was his decision to behave selfishly rather than die for the greater good. As the district officer, Pilkings is tasked with maintaining order in the colony, primarily by stamping out the local religion and replacing it with Christianity. However, the way that Pilkings behaves suggests that while he doesn't respect the local people and their religions at any time, he has even less respect for them when someone is watching, in this case, the Prince of England. Pilkings takes the news of Elesin's impending suicide so seriously only because there's someone extremely important around whom he'd like to impress by making it appear as though the colony is safe and under control. This is something that, in the context of the logic and goals of a colonial power, Pilkings should be trying to do all the time in order to properly serve the British Empire. In this way, Soyinka shows that Pilkings's attempt to stop Elesin is actually undertaken to help the empire further its goals. It's a way for him to look good and nothing more. His failure to either stop Elesin or impress the prince shows that performing one's duty only when it's convenient is wildly ineffective and misguided. In his conversation with Jane, Alland encourages her to look beyond her horror at the idea of ritual suicide and see that within the Yoruba belief system, Elesin is doing his people a massive favor by ensuring their spiritual wellness. He also expands this idea to encompass the entire globe by suggesting that sacrificing one person for the sake of hundreds or thousands of others is usually worth it. Jane mentions in an offhand way that several weeks ago a ship's captain died in the harbor when he exploded his ship, which contained some kind of dangerous material and posed a risk to the people living around the harbor. She insists that the captain's sacrifice was disgusting and unnecessary, while Alland encourages her to see it as an affirmative commentary on life. In contrast, he points out that English soldiers are dying at alarming rates in the war, while English newscasters insist that the country is experiencing victory after victory. In other words, that the English are sacrificing droves of people while also refusing to honor them by calling the deaths of those men a massive humanitarian crisis. Because Alland believes so strongly in this sense of duty to the communal good, it's shocking for him when Elesin appears very much alive and therefore within the logic of Yoruba theology, not looking out for the good of his people. Alland then shows himself to be the most honorable and dutiful character of the play by doing what he knows he must do and killing himself to take Elesin's place as the king's horseman in the afterlife. While this poses its own moral dilemmas, Alan won't be able to go on and save lives as a doctor, for instance, nor will he be able to serve the next king as a horseman. Taking Elesin's place means that Alan is at least attempting to rebalance the cosmic order of the entire world and perform his duty by being willing to properly complete the task set out before him that benefits many, not just himself. Colonialism. In the introduction to the play, Soyinka says outright that it's inappropriate and reductive to consider Death and the King's Horseman only as a play about a clash of cultures and the role of colonialism in Nigeria. Instead, he encourages readers and prospective directors to focus on the conflict that Elesin experiences as he fails to follow through with his suicide for a host of other reasons not related to Pilkings's attempts to stop him. Despite this warning, the fact remains that colonialism, racism, and prejudice loom large over the story, if only because it takes place in colonial Nigeria during World War II. When considered in terms of colonialism, the action of Death and the King's Horseman becomes less about one man's failure to uphold his society's traditions and maintain cosmic order. Instead, Elesin and Alan's deaths come to symbolize the death of the Yoruba society a whole under colonial rule. It becomes clear in the side comments and observations of all characters, Yoruba and English alike, that the city of Oyo has a long and tragic history of European occupation that, even in the play's present, influences all the characters. When Pilkings arrests and imprisons Elesin, for example, Elesin is chained in a cellar where slaves bound for North America were once held. Though he's not taken to North America like his forebears, Elesin suffers at the hands of white invaders who wish to maintain control over African bodies and customs by imprisoning them and denying them dignity and agency. In the same vein, much of Pilkings's distress when he learns about Elesin's upcoming suicide has to do with the fact that the prince is visiting the colony and, as far as the prince is aware, Nigeria is a rare, calm, and safe colonial state amidst the horrors of World War II. In other words, it's absolutely essential for Pilkings to suppress local customs that might not go over well with the colony's prince in order to maintain the illusion that after nearly a century of occupation, the locals are subdued and are no longer a threat to their occupiers even when those threats don't threaten Pilkings directly or, for that matter, the presence or ruling power of the English as a group. There are indicators, however, that despite the generations of English occupation in Nigeria, the English are only barely suppressing what Pilkings at least sees as an even greater threat than violence, revolt, or losing administrative power, the local culture and belief system. Though Amusa, a Nigerian man converted to Islam and is now a sergeant serving under Pilkings, he cannot bear to look at Pilkings and Jane when he finds them wearing the igungan in preparation for the costume ball to be held that night in the prince's honor. He attempts to explain to Pilkings that it's wildly inappropriate for them to wear the igungan and, further, that it's disrespectful even for Amusa to touch or look at the costumes when discussing a matter related to death. What's most galling for Pilkings in this situation is that, as far as he's concerned, Amusa was supposed to have left his respect and belief for any mumbo-jumbo behind when he converted to Islam. This reveals that Pilkings's true goal is to stamp out the local culture and belief systems. While Elesin and Pilkings seem to represent two ends of a spectrum, Elesin's son Alan, who is in the process of training to be a doctor in England, represents the potential for a middle ground. When Alan arrives, Pilkings is initially thrilled, as he thinks that Alan will be a voice of reason who can talk sense into Elesin and stop his ritual suicide. Despite 4 years of life and training in England, however, Alan calmly explains that he only returned to Nigeria to bury his father. He explains that the ritual will go on, no matter what anyone says to the contrary, and furthermore, that it's essential that it happen. This suggests that, like Amusa, Alan still respects and understands the belief system he grew up with, even as he steps firmly into the Western world by training as a doctor. His time in England doesn't compromise his knowledge that upon his father's death, he needs to bury his father and perform rituals reserved for a firstborn son. Alan's suicide after Elesin's failure then becomes indicative of Alan's belief in the importance of maintaining these traditions and making sure that, at least in the cosmic realm, the culture persists properly. The fact that both Alan and Elesin die, however, and especially that Alan dies without ever becoming the king's horseman in an official capacity, and without leaving behind children of his own, makes it so that the custom cannot continue into the next generation. Through Alan's insights into both Yoruba and English culture, the play suggests that there's massive potential for cross-cultural understanding through education and a desire to learn, while through his death, the play drives home the massive human and cultural consequences of elevating the beliefs of the colonizers over those of the colonized, a cost that harms everyone in the long run. Symbols. Key symbols in Wole Soyinka's death and the king's horsemen include chains representing the lingering effects of colonial oppression and the dehumanization of African culture. The Not-I bird symbolizing the natural mentality of the Yoruba people toward death and the willingness to meet it. The Gungan costumes representing the connection between the living and the dead, as well as cosmic law. European music symbolizing the weakness and inappropriateness of British culture in Nigeria, and the marketplace, a liminal space where the living, the dead, and the unborn converge. Chains. The chains bind Elesin, but they are the very chains used to bind slaves during the slave trade. They symbolize the lingering colonial influence and the ways in which the ideology of European superiority continues to suppress and dehumanize native culture and people. Elesin's suicide. Elesin's death by suicide using these chains shows that even after the end of the slave trade, the oppressive beliefs that fueled it continue to be a destructive force. The Not-I bird. The Not-I bird is an important symbol of the Yoruba mindset regarding death. Elesin's acceptance of this symbol demonstrates his readiness to fulfill his duty and embrace death as a natural part of the cycle of life. Gungan costumes and masks. These ceremonial costumes allow the wearer to channel the spirits of the dead. They represent the connection between the living and the dead, and embody cosmic law and order. Their presence on the pilkings, who are uninitiated, highlights their misuse and the colonial attempt to impose their own misguided interpretation of Yoruba customs. European music. The weak and poor quality European music in the play serves as a pointed symbol. It represents the inappropriateness and lack of vitality of British colonialism in Nigeria, contrasting sharply with the robust and natural strength of the native Yoruba music and culture. The marketplace. The marketplace is a central setting in the play and has significant symbolic weight. It is a liminal space where the living, the dead, and the unborn all meet, representing the fluidity and interconnectedness of these realms and the immediate presence of both possibility and danger.